This is a Frontline Club event recorded on 14th of May 2020. A discussion on US elections with Susan Glasser, Ed O'Keefe, and Jim Naughtie.
Welcome to the Frontline Club in London. Today we have a terrific conversation on a subject that, if it wasn't interesting enough before the US presidential election, it's even more so and probably even more consequential. And we're going to be talking about the way the coronavirus is affecting American politics, how it could affect voting in November, and also how it could affect the candidates. To what degree will this play to the strengths and weaknesses of the two major candidates? And we have a terrific panel today. First, we're going to introduce James Naughtie, special correspondent for BBC News. He has a new book out, just came out last month. It's called On the Road, American Adventures from Nixon to Trump.
I can now wait.
James, maybe you can show that to, great, there it is.
I will.
And
the audio is available in the States, incidentally.
Terrific. And
Okay.
not only does James have the book, but the Mail on Sunday calls it thought-provoking, constantly surprising, and hugely entertaining. Jim presented the Today program on Radio 4 for 20 years in the States since 1970. Up in the higher panel is Ed O'Keefe. You know him from working as a political correspondent at CBS News, covering the campaign. He previously covered the U.S. Congress for the Washington Post and reported on the 2008 and 2012 presidential and congressional elections. And just below me in the panel below is Susan Glasser, who writes the column Letter from Trump's Washington at the New Yorker, where she's a staff writer. She was top editor of several Washington publications. She was the editor at Politico and editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy, and worked for a decade at the Washington Post. So it's a fabulous lineup that actually in ordinary times, in the midst of the campaign, we probably couldn't do here in London. There's no way we'd be able to get everybody across the Atlantic. So to some degree, this is kind of fortunate. I wanted to start and ask you, whoever would like to jump in, maybe Susan on this, and that is, how has the pandemic changed the issues in this race 5 months out from Election Day? And which candidate do you think is better positioned to take advantage of it?
Well, thank you so much, Frank, and thank you obviously to everyone who's tuning in today. It's always good to take a break, although I have to say, like in the past, we were always looking for opportunities to take a break from Trump's Washington, but one subsidiary result, of course, of the pandemic is that we are all stuck 24 hours a day in the same loop of coverage. And I would say that really is the signal storyline of both this year and this American presidential election, which is that the pandemic has overwhelmed any other story. It has completely disrupted not only daily life in the US and across the globe, but it has rewritten the presidential campaign in a way that you can probably tell if you're paying even casual attention to Donald Trump's Twitter feed. It has left him deeply unsettled and deeply concerned. Most American presidential elections after 4 years of an incumbent are referenda on the incumbent. And I think that's going to be all the more so the case given that we're experiencing such a disruptive event, not only with enormous public health consequences, and by the way, we're set to surpass 100,000 deaths from the coronavirus this month in the United States, but also, of course, to the economy. So, it's put Trump back on his heels in a defensive mode that has him lashing out. But one cautionary note before I let everybody else jump in, which is to say, because Trump has been such a polarizing and divisive figure for so long, it means that very few people haven't already made up their minds about him. And so we are not seeing the wild swings of public opinion about Trump, and also therefore the wild disruptions in political polling that you might expect, or that you're seeing in the UK, for example. And so, views of Trump are remarkably stable and fixed. And actually, if you look, his approval rating right now is right around 40%, which is right exactly where it's basically been since January 20th, 2017.
And I wanted to go to you for a question to follow up on what Susan just said, and that is usually an election after a first term, the economy really is very determinative. If you have a good economy, that's very positive for the incumbent. And Trump was going to run on the economy until a few months ago. Do you see, how much do you see the economy playing into this? And given the numbers that Susan was just talking about, the highest in the world, do you get a sense that some voters will hold him accountable for that?
You were talking to me, Frank, right?
Yeah, Ed, excuse me,
Yeah.
yes.
Oh, it'll totally be an issue. You know, as some have said, by November, every American is either going to know somebody who's lost a job or know somebody who's died from this. And so how can that not in one way or another potentially wear on their decision? And to Susan's point, he has an incredibly fixed percentage of people who like him. But for the small percentage of people in this country who might swing either way, by November, it's just going to depend a lot on, do I still have a job? Does my family, do my children, do my neighbors, what happened to my sick relative who had this disease and how well were they treated? They will take it out in one way or another on either the president or some other down ballot election that they're holding in their community, because it's one of the ways that they'll be able to express themselves. And so the economy absolutely will be a top concern. The president knows that. He's terrified at the prospect of being judged on it. Just this morning, he was asked in an interview with the Fox Business Network about it. Host pointed out that about 36 million people now are unemployed, and he immediately snapped and said, "Well, but nobody blames me for that." You can't blame him for the pandemic necessarily, but certainly the decisions made since then are ones that many are going to blame him for. And one of them is the economic fallout of this, especially if other parts of the country other parts of the world are seen to be rebounding from this faster than the United States can as a whole. So it's a big concern for him. And it certainly now is really the only issue at this point. It's coronavirus and, management of it, general competence, the economy, and how do you get the country out of this? And that's it. I mean, there's really very little room for anything else at this point. Maybe it's some tangential wedge issue like the future of the Supreme Court. But beyond that, there's really nothing else to talk about. Nothing else really that most voters will worry about going into November.
Jim, I'd like to go to you. You've been in and out of the United States since the 70s, as your book points out. I'd just like to get a sense of how the country feels to you in the last year or two, and especially heading into this election, compared to other elections that you've followed. As a bit of an outsider with a different lens, curious to see how you see it.
I think there are two things that I'd say, Frank, in answer to that. And the first is just following up what Susan and Ed have said about the campaign. It seems to me what's fascinating about it, when you look at how the economy will play compared with what everybody thought it would do in the campaign 9 months ago. What has happened in this campaign is that the culture war, as I suppose we all call it, which, began in the mid-90s really, but exploded into life with the Trump election and the production of Trump as almost the end point of that culture war between right and left, or right and liberals. What this means is that whole question of what your sets of beliefs are that you cannot abandon and have to wave like a banner in war becomes even more the defining question of this campaign, because of Trump's predicament in how he's handled an obvious crisis, is that he is going to have to, as the common phrase has it now, double down on Trump versus the world. Limbaugh was saying the other night, it's war. I read Tucker Carlson's latest meditation on the crisis the other night. And I mean, it is now, the culture war squared. Now, you could argue that's good for Trump, but picking up on Ed's point, it seems to me that if you look at the people who were falling off the Trump wagon in the 2018 midterms, for example, especially in suburbs, are they going to decide that faced with this polar question, they side with Trump, given what's happened in the last 3 months? As an outsider, I would have thought that's a big ask for his campaign. But just one last thing to answer your central point. I first arrived in the States as an 18-year-old student in 1970 and, went around the country in a Greyhound bus, which we all did after a summer working in a kosher hotel in the Borscht Belt, which dropped me more than, I think I could have learned in 5 years anywhere else. It was fantastic. Anyway, of course, it was at the height of the Vietnam era, or at least 2/3 through it. And I realized in a way that I'd sort of realized from newsreels and so on, but not with my own eyes, how extraordinarily divisive that was in families and in small towns, because everyone knew someone who had had a tragedy. And of course, the number of dead in the virus crisis has now exceeded the number, 60,000 thereabouts, who died in Vietnam. It seems to me, as a regular visitor over the years, I mean, several times a year, that America's never actually been as divided as it was during Vietnam, for very, very different reasons. The history of it is completely different. The wild 60s were a prelude to what happened with the war as a backdrop. This is completely different, but the divisions in families between people and people who are holding ever more strongly and devotedly to their belief, their position, the set of values that they represent, seems to me more divided than I've ever known it before. That is an outsider's view, but I feel it very strongly.
Ed and Susan, you made a great point, which is President Trump's support rarely goes below 40%. And I think a lot of people in Europe, they consume the same news everyone else does about President Trump. That surprises them. And so the question I had is, can you explain to people why he has that hard floor, what he seems to have a very hard, strong floor in the low 40s? And who is he and who are he and Joe Biden going to be fighting over? Most people know Joe Biden very well. They know Donald Trump very well in the United States. Who are they fighting over, or will this really come down to turnout? Whoever wants to jump in first.
Well, I mean, to the point about is anyone in America left who is persuadable, right? Essentially is the question that you're asking. There are really two different models to our national elections. And historically, right, there were sort of core Democratic areas, core Republican areas, and toss-up states. Ohio was always seen as the decider, or Florida more recently. But essentially, Donald Trump didn't invent this political polarization. It's actually been, increasing over the last couple decades. So when I was a kid, the election of 1976, there were 24 states, out of 50 that were genuinely competitive in that election, which was very close between Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford. Flash forward to the election before Donald Trump, there were essentially 10 states that were seen as at all competitive, right? So it's a shrinkage in half, really, of the competitive playing field of American politics before Donald Trump, who's one of the most naturally divisive political figures we've ever seen. So he is taking that pre-existing condition of polarization, I think, and putting it on steroids. And, even Barack Obama, who of course has a very different political affect, is a different kind of political character,